We just listened to Billie Holiday performing the song Strange Fruit, which is a very powerful and disturbing song, very powerful imagery. As I mentioned before, it's a song that's been covered many times down through the years, including recently. Just imagine the courage that it took for an African American woman in that time period to sing such a song. But before we move away completely from the subject of lynching, as difficult a subject as that is, there's one thing I wanted to share with you, and that is this graphic that comes from a very recently released study in which the people who did the study had done a lot of footwork to try to track down in news media and etc. as accurate and as complete a list of lynchings in the former Confederate states as they could. It had been a long time since anyone had made such an effort, and with the digital history tools and etc. at our command now, it was time to do it again. They actually discovered, I think it was something like 700 more lynchings in the time period in question than had previously been believed. So this is a graphic basically just showing the former states of the Confederacy from around the end of Reconstruction up until about 1950, and there were almost 4,000 incidents. But bear in mind, this doesn't count the big spike in such incidents right after the Civil War, and I don't think it includes, well, it only includes the former Confederate states. There are a lot of other areas where this happened. Nonetheless, it is a very disturbing piece of information about just how many of these things actually had occurred. It's really sad to say it's a fairly commonplace thing for a long time. All right, well, now we are going to move on to a brief discussion of a couple of very significant figures in the African American community during the early part of the Jim Crow era. These are two African American leaders who took very different approaches and had very different backgrounds, both of whom you've probably heard of. We're going to start with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born in slavery. In fact, I believe he was a teenager during the Civil War, so his entire childhood was spent in slavery. Eventually, by the 1890s, he had a position at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which was a school. In one sense, it was what they used to call a normal school, which isn't the opposite of abnormal. A normal school is what they used to call schools that specifically trained teachers. But it also taught vocational skills, and this was for young African American students to come and get these skills so that they could be employable. In 1901, Booker T. Washington wrote his autobiography, or it was published, Up from Slavery. By that time, he had already been fairly famous enough that in the early 1900s, he was invited to the White House by Teddy Roosevelt as a dinner guest, which was the first time that any African American had been invited to dinner at the White House by the president. Of course, he still couldn't come in through the front door. He had to come in through the back door because Washington was segregated at that time. As you can see with this quote, which I'm not going to dignify by reading because that's not the kind of language that I like to use. You can read it for yourself. This is a quote from South Carolina Senator Ben Tillman, also known as Pitchfork Ben Tillman. And basically he is criticizing President Roosevelt for having this black man in the White House and is saying that now we're going to have to kill about 1,000 of them in the South before they'll learn their place again. This speech that I'm referring to here, the Atlanta Cotton Exposition speech, 1895, is what really brought Booker T. Washington onto the national radar, so to speak. This was a speech given, along with a lot of other speeches, by people who were here for this agricultural convention, really. And Booker T. Washington, who was extolling the benefits of his school, laid out what he thought the plan should be for the African American community to move forward. These are some of the things he called for. He called for black people to adjust to segregation, to not agitate for civil rights, not to resist, but spend their energies building up their own communities instead. They should be training for farm and factory jobs. They shouldn't be really wasting their time aiming for higher education, trying to be professionals, doctors, lawyers, or professors, but rather to be realistic. They should be seeking the help of white employers, especially in the South, who at that time were tired of dealing with white workers because they kept trying to unionize. In other words, go along to get along. Show yourself to be a submissive worker and an effective worker, and don't get too agitated and riled up about the whole Jim Crow situation. As he put it, the races were like separate fingers all on the same hand. So that was his approach. W.E.B. Du Bois, looks like it should be pronounced Dubois, but he pronounced it Du Bois, was a different story. Du Bois was from a previous generation, a subsequent generation to Booker T. Washington. Quite a few years younger, also a very different background. He was not born in slavery in the South, he was born in the North as a free man. I don't think his parents were slaves either. Anyhow, he had a completely different experience, growing up as he did post-Civil War in the North. As a young man in the 1890s, around the same time that Booker T. Washington was giving his talk, Du Bois was in Tennessee, in Nashville, at Fisk University, and he was working as a school teacher. He was commuting, I think, mostly in the summers, to DeKalb County, Tennessee, to Alexandria, where he taught at a black school there. Later, along with Ida Wells, he was one of the people who co-founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And his thrust was more that, well, yes, you should aim as highly as possible. You should agitate. He had this theory of what he called the talented tenth, basically implying that there was about 10 percentage points of African Americans, just like any group of people, who had a lot of talents, and that if they became doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs and etc., they would be pulling their communities up with them. He also wrote a book a couple of years after Up From Slavery came out, The Soul of Black Folk, and his book on Reconstruction is still considered to be one of the best books on Reconstruction. He eventually got a PhD in sociology, although as a black student in the South, when he was doing his work, a lot of times he wasn't even able to go through the libraries and read, search for the things that he needed for his dissertation. He had to go in through the back and work in the basement and have the books brought to him. So these two individuals, very different approaches. It would be easy to say in retrospect that one was right and one was wrong. Both of them, however, had a significant impact. And I think that to be fair to Booker T. Washington, you have to remember that he was born and raised in slavery in conditions in which, if you said the wrong thing at the wrong time, you could very easily lose your life for it. So it's not really surprising in retrospect that he called for a more conservative and a slower approach to things than Du Bois did. Now, Du Bois we're going to be talking about a lot more. He's still going to be on the scene all the way up into the 1960s.